I'm going to get right to it. The focus of today's show is the new KEF Q Concerto Meta 3-way stand mount speaker. It's part of the new Q series that runs from the Q1, which is $600 a pair, to the Q11, the larger of the tower speakers, which is $2,200 a pair. The Q Concerto is actually $1,300 a pair, so it's kind of in the middle of that line price-wise. Before I go any further, I just want to mention this in passing. I have over 200 speaker reviews on this channel on a playlist, so they're really easy to find, and there's a lot to get through. So anyway, if you're into speaker reviews, I have a huge assortment for your personal enjoyment. Let's get back to the Q Concerto review. I have a feeling that some of you KEF fans are thinking, doesn't the Q Concerto Meta look exactly like the KEF R3 Meta? Not really. The R3 Meta is finished to a higher standard. It has a larger Uni-Q driver. It has more connectivity options on its rear end. It's a different speaker, and I'm sorry, I don't have it here to do an A-B comparison. As for the Q Concerto's Uni-Q driver, it's a 4-inch driver with a 1-inch aluminum dome tweeter in the center. It's called a coincident design. So the mid-range part of it is a 4-inch driver. The center part is the 1-inch tweeter. But I just want to discuss ever so briefly what Meta is. Meta is an absorption technology that KEF uses to absorb the back wave of the tweeter. So there's not reflections going on behind the tweeter itself. It's just responding to signal, so it produces a much clearer, more transparent sound. That's what this technology is for. Surrounding the Uni-Q driver is what KEF calls the shadow flare. It's basically a waveguide for the Uni-Q driver. Now the woofer in this speaker is a 6-inch woofer with an aluminum skin, but behind that is paper, so it's a 2-part driver. We call it a hybrid design. Round back, there is a port and also a pair of gold binding plugs. Now these speakers, all the Meta speakers come in 3 finishes, your choice: satin black, satin white, or the walnut that I have here. And to tell you the truth, I can't tell whether this is real walnut or vinyl. But if it is vinyl, it looks awfully realistic. So later on in this review, I'm going to compare the Q Concerto Meta with the KEF LS50 Meta and also the Buchardt S400 Mark II. Oh, and a little tiny bit with the Klipsch RP600M Mark II. Now here we are looking at the specifications, and a couple of them jump out. First is the sensitivity of this speaker. It is rated at 85 dB. That's pretty low sensitivity, meaning it takes some power to make it come alive. And the other one is the impedance. It's rated at 4 ohms, dipping down to 3.2 ohms. So this is a very, let's just call it a current-hungry speaker. You need to use some juice with this speaker to make it really come alive. And to provide that juice, I use a few different amplifiers, but mainly 2. The Emotiva TA2, which is an integrated amplifier, it sells for $900, so it's price appropriate for use with these speakers. And it puts out 200 watts a channel into 4 ohms, so it's certainly capable in that regard. But I also use the Q Concerto in my main system with the Past Labs XA25 power amp, linear tube audio, microzonal preamp, Mola DAC, the usual suspects. I talk about them in all the reviews. But anyway, I use those 2 different systems to get a feel as to what this speaker was really capable of. My first and lasting impression of the sound of the Q Concerto speaker was it's a very easy to listen to speaker. It's not at all fatiguing. And it's very pleasant sounding, and I mean that as a compliment. It's not, and it's fairly high res, but it's not the kind of resolution that shouts at you. It's not like grabbing your attention. No, it just releases the music. The imaging is very wide and spacious. It's not clinging to the speakers themselves, the locations of the speakers. It just creates a wall of sound. I would say I didn't hear a lot of dimensionality in that soundstage, soundstage depth, that sort of thing. That wasn't happening so much. But in terms of sounding really open and spacious, yes, the Q Concerto Meta can really do that. And it's a three-way speaker, and it makes, I would say, a reasonable amount of bass for a speaker of its size. It's rated to go down to, I think, 48 hertz plus or minus 3 dB, and goes down to 40 hertz at minus 6 dB. It makes bass. It is a full sounding speaker. I doubt that too many people would actually add a subwoofer to this speaker, unless, of course, you listen to a lot of bass-heavy music or you're using it in a home theater system, that sort of thing. Yeah, but most of the time I don't think people would add a bass. But if you were, I would strongly recommend the KEF KC62 subwoofer. I reviewed that a few years ago. I will link to that below. That is a fantastic subwoofer. First music selection I'm going to tell you about, it is this one, and this is not the usual for me, but this is mezzo-soprano Marina Volti, and she's a classically trained singer, and she's got the big voice, but she's doing an odd mix of music. She's doing songs from Johnny Cash and U2 and Bjork, but the one that really grabbed me, she covers Metallica's Nothing Else Matters. And as I'm saying it, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about how incredible she sounded over the Q Concerto speakers. She sounded very present, but it's her soaring vocal style. It's just so intense. It's a gorgeous recording. It's very minimally produced with just lute and very tasteful electronics. She's the star, she gets the attention, and she deserves it. She is great. And I gotta say, yeah, these speakers, the Q Concertos, were really giving me a full dose of what Marina can actually belt out. You know, I love contrast, to go from one piece of music to the next. I want to change it up all the time, right? So I'm playing early electric prunes. I had too much to dream last night. Oh yeah, these fuzzed out sputtering guitars and this kick-ass rhythm section, and I'm turning it up, and I am really digging. I got a big smile on my face. Yeah, I love my job. But it's the ragged glories of this music. But then I went to another Electric Prunes record, Mass in F minor, which has a classical influence in it, big time actually. And so much so that, as I've heard, a lot of the members of the band quit while they were making this record. It was such difficult music for them. But it's beautiful. And it's still, to me, it has the true essence of the band, but it has these classical overtones. And I admit that a lot of times that doesn't work. But for me, this one really works. If anything, this is my favorite right now, Electric Prunes album. And they both sound really good. So yeah, I mean, there was nothing about this music, the way it was recorded or equalized or compressed, that irritated me as I listened to the Q Concerto Meta. So next up, I'm listening to Duke Ellington. I'm going for like full immersion here, right? And it's big band and there's brass, and there's also, for some reason, I've never heard him use flutes the way he does on this album. And I'm really digging the sound. But then I'm thinking, but wait a second, the one thing that gives me pause here is dynamics. The speaker can play loud, easily, no strain, but is it lacking something in the dynamics department? So I popped in one of my other references, the Klipsch RP600M Mark II, which is obviously a horn speaker. The Klipsch has much higher rated sensitivity, 94 dB sensitivity versus the Q Concerto Meta's 85 dB. That's a big difference. In that contest, the RP600M, for about half the price of the KEF, it was more alive sounding, definitely to me. But in terms of soundstage spaciousness and imaging and that kind of open quality, oh yeah, definitely the Q Concerto Meta wins on that front. The next challenger in this story was, yes, the KEF LS50 Meta. Now this is a more expensive speaker. It's $1,600 a pair. And it's a lot smaller than the Q Concerto. And the Q Concerto was a three-way, and it has a 6-inch woofer. So yeah, guess what? The Q Concerto sounds like a bigger, fuller, richer sounding speaker. No doubt about it. But I'm playing this soundtrack collection from Ry Cooder. And there's this movie that he did music for, Streets of Fire. And it's kind of a rock-oriented thing. And I gotta say, Ry Cooder is playing electric guitar on the level of Keith Richards. And I'm not joking. I mean, Ry Cooder played on a bunch of Stones records back in the day. And a little bit here, a little bit there. But anyway, he sounds like Keith on this. And it's raw, high-energy music. And I'm switching between the Q Concerto and the LS50 Meta. And for this kind of music, the size advantage of the Q Concerto was very obvious, right? It just had more weight, more thrust, more power. And the LS50, by comparison, sounded a little anemic, to put it bluntly. But when I played other tracks on this album that weren't so heavy, I would say the advantages of the LS50 Meta came through in its terms of its transparency and purity and razor sharp transient response and all that. It was definitely a step up from the Q Concerto Meta. Another way to put this is that the LS50 is a small room speaker and the Q Concerto Meta is a better big room speaker. That's a fair way of looking at this comparison. And and also for near field, if you want to really listen near field and you're not into really cranking it, the LS50 Meta is a clear winner, at least it is for me. So they're doing different things. Next up was the Buchardt S400 Mark II. Now the S400 Mark II has a secret weapon on the back side. It has a very large passive radiator that fills pretty much the entire back of the speaker. So even though it's not a very big speaker, it can actually make a substantial amount of bass for its size. It's also more expensive than the Q Concerto Meta. The S400 Mark II is $2,200 when I last checked. Anyway, it is a more expensive speaker. And I'm playing the Grateful Dead's classic American Beauty. And the harmonies, and I'm starting on the Buchardt speaker. And the harmonies are just so beautiful. And just the playing on that record, the recording is just so, it's up there with the very, very best. So then I switch over to the Q Concerto Meta, and the soundstage opened up. It bloomed. The Q Concerto Meta is definitely on the sweet, more relaxed side of treble. And compared to the S400 Mark II, that speaker had more liveliness in the top end while I was listening to American Beauty. Because the S400 Mark II has a passive radiator, make more bass, I expected it to have a bigger sound on the bottom, but it didn't. The Q Concerto Meta's low end was just more, it was fuller, weightier, definitely, than the S400 Mark II. So it was a little of this, a little of that. There's no clear winners in these contests, but I'm describing the difference. So I can't say that one is better than the other. I could just say how they are different from each other. I mentioned earlier that I was using two different sets of electronics, and most of the comments that I've given you so far were with the Emotiva TA2 integrated amplifier, $900. So again, it's a price-appropriate amplifier for this speaker. But when I switched over to the Pass XA25 power amp and the linear tube audio preamp and the Mola DAC and all that stuff, well, yeah, all the speakers sounded considerably better when used with better electronics. Now, I would say that when I was listening to the Q Concerto Meta with the good stuff, it just got better and more detailed and more open and more spacious and faster and clearer sounding. Everything about the sound, not surprisingly, got a lot better. If you have those urges, as many of us do, to upgrade your electronics in your front end, turntable or DAC or something, yes, the Q Concerto Meta will let you hear those improvements. In that sense, it's very transparent to its source. Okay, so we have now approached that very special time where I do. So Steve, what do you really think of the KEF Q Concerto Meta stand mount speaker? I think it's a lot of speaker for the money. Every now and then in the process of doing this review, I forgot I was reviewing a $1,300 speaker. It really is an overachiever in most regards. But it's not going to be the one. It's not the kind of speaker that shouts transparency or hits you really hard with high impact bass. It's not doing that. It is a more subtle performer, really. And I love it for that. As I said earlier, I think some people think that like the LS50 is too bright or too aggressive or too mid-range. I don't think so. But if you do, this speaker will be definitely a better alternative, and you save you money and sound like a bigger speaker. So it has a lot of pluses going for it. And yes, and it does show as you make improvements in your system, its sound will just get better and better and better. And speaking of better and better and better, yes, it is now time for the Audiophiliac viewer system of the day. Hey, this is Gary's system. He lives in Olean, New York. His speakers are Martin Logan Expression 13As. Those are electrostatics. And they are being driven by a pair of Macintosh MC601 amplifiers. There's also SVS 2000 Pro subwoofers and an AudioQuest 707 power distribution unit. Now moving on to the second room, there's a Macintosh C2700 preamplifier, and everything in that picture is running through the 2700 preamp, including the Otari MX5050 reel-to-reel and also the Pioneer 2022 reel-to-reel. There's two turntables, a VPI Prime 21, and that has an Audifon MC Quintet cartridge. The other turntable is an AR, and that has an ADC LF M2 tone arm with a Sonus Blue labeled cartridge. And there's a CD transport from Macintosh, that's the MCT 500. The tuner is a Pioneer TX 9500, and there's also a Tascam 133 cassette deck. The music server was built by Gary. Anyway, that's quite the system. Thank you, Gary. All right, we are back. My name is Steve Guttenberg, and I am the Audiophiliac. Thank you guys for watching the channel. You might know that this channel is supported now mostly by my patrons over at Patreon. And if you'd like to join in and help keep this thing going, I would be forever thankful. And I am now creating content that is exclusive to Patreon. So in other words, it's not shown here on the channel. They're not reviews, but they're other kinds of videos that I'm doing just for my patrons. So if you're interested in that, please check out the Patreon. And with that, I can say, yes, thank you so much for watching. I really, really do hope to see you back here again very, very soon. Bye-bye.